Good morning, everyone. A happy new year. Hope you had an excellent start in 2026. Very good morning and warm welcome from sunny ICMPD headquarters here in Vienna. A very warm welcome from my side. Thanks for taking the time this morning to join this webinar. It has become kind of a tradition, a very valued tradition for ICMPD to begin every year with an outlook on key migration developments and events to watch out in 2026. We are delighted to present the ICMPD Migration Outlook for this year, 2026, over the next hour. My name is Alfred Wöger, working in ICMPD's Member States program. I'm also very pleased to have for this webinar a sparring partner by my side, my fabulous colleague Madeleine Höld, who will be co-moderating this webinar with me. Madeleine, I think we are almost ready to start.
Yes, Alfred, and good morning everyone from my side as well. It is really nice to see so many of you joining us today. I see we already have 78 participants. Thanks a lot for attending. And this is already the 9th edition of ICMPD's Migration Outlook. And I personally cannot wait for my colleague to share his perspective on key migration and developments for this year. But before we do that, Alfred, I think there were still some practical points that you wanted to raise, no?
Exactly, that's right. So as you might have noticed, this session will be recorded, and both the recording and the presentation slides will be shared with you after the webinar. We have also set aside dedicated time, of course, as usual, at the end of the presentation for some questions and discussions. So that's actually the moment when we then will open properly the floor to go through the questions together. But this does, of course, not mean that everyone has to stay completely silent until then during the entire webinar. Please feel free to ask your questions at any point during the webinar. You can simply put them in the chat as they come to your mind. We will, of course, keep an eye on the chat and make sure that your questions are addressed either during the presentation, if it fits, or then in the dedicated time for Q&A. Madeleine, I think it's time to present ICMPD's Crystal Ball.
And ICMPD's crystal ball is no one else but our principal advisor, Martin Hoffmann. And of course, he doesn't claim to foretell the future or to cover all relevant migration trends, but he simply, based on his past experience, highlights what might happen in 2026, as well as what's important to consider in the year ahead. So, Martin, it's so great to have you with us today, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I assume with this fast-changing environment, it must have been particularly challenging to prepare the outlook this year, no?
Good morning, everybody. Also from my side, good morning, Alfred and Madeleine, and thank you very much for the introduction. I've been called many things in my life, but I think I've never been called a crystal ball. So I will try to live up to this expectation in the next hour to a certain extent. The most stressful part, I think, this year of the migration outlook process was actually setting up the technical conditions for today's meeting. And I'm very happy and grateful to the colleagues that this worked in the end. More difficult, yes, every year I think there's more situations and there's more trends and more developments and more aspects to be covered and to be included. This is why this document also gets longer every day. So yes, more difficult, but I still think manageable.
Thanks. Before we move to your presentation, however, we would still like to hear from you, our participants. So for this purpose, we will be using Slido throughout the webinar. If you don't know it, Slido should be opening up automatically on the right-hand side of your screen whenever we ask a question in the poll for you. And just to already flag it at the beginning, the Q&A function at the end of the presentation will also be available there, yeah? But as Alfred mentioned before, please, whenever you have a question throughout the webinar, just post it in the chat and we will address it in due time, yeah?
Exactly. So we prepared a question for you and would be very interested in your views. You might have noticed now Slido is already opening on the right side of your screen. You should be able to see the question. I am able to do so. I hope that works also for you. And I see already a few people typing. And the question refers, what do you think will shape migration in the EU in 2026? So we take a few moments so that you can share your thoughts, and we'll give you a few seconds and look then at the results together. With that, I think we can have a look at the results. Okay, so I think there are a few topics that you've mentioned. Labor shortages, the pact, of course, war developments in Ukraine, Trump, but there's also neighborhood is mentioned, conflict, situation in Libya, Putin. A lot of different topics. I think a lot of these topics are also addressed in this year's Outlook. Thanks for sharing your perspectives. Martin, do you have any initial reactions to the input we are seeing from the participants?
Well, my first initial reaction is that I'm kind of relieved that many of the points that were raised or the key or buzzwords were raised somehow are either integrated in our migration outlook or were seriously considered in the course of developing and writing it, and will also form part of my presentation that will start very soon. So thank you very much. We are in line with what you think might be relevant for next year, and I think that's the first good and positive conclusion.
Thanks, Martin. And I believe it's now time to take a closer look at the developments that ICMPD has identified as most likely to shape migration dynamics in 2026. And with this, Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for the presentation. Here we go. So here we go. Everybody sees the presentation. Another triumph, at least for me as an old person, in this technical issue. So let's go in it right away. I should be able to move it. Did not work now. So I'm asking the colleagues. So I cannot move the presentation forward. Maybe someone else does it for me. And we move to the first slide. Let's do it the old way. I will ask the colleagues to move the slides. So here we go. What is the purpose of the ICMPD Migration Outlook? Well, basically, could make it short and simply say exactly what we are doing here today is the purpose of the ICMPD Migration Outlook. Basically, to start a discussion, to open a discussion between all those that are involved in migration, migration policy, migration management, inside and outside of the organization. The basic concept is fairly simple. The Migration Outlook should look at the trends and developments, facts and figures of the previous year, so 2025, and based on this analysis, provide an outlook for the current year, for 2026, in this case, on important developments and events. As Madeleine has already said, it is not intended to say what will happen. It is intended to say what might happen and what might be relevant. And it's also important to state that contrary to our normal work, it also does not say what should happen. So it does not conclude with concrete recommendations or options for policy making. Again, this should be part of the discussion. Next slide, please. It is basically a scenario. For those of you who are familiar with the scenario technique or method, normally it's 4 scenarios that are built with reference to a certain indicator, a certain development. We only have one. Why? Because it's much broader. We look at different aspects. But what we also try to do is to present a possible and plausible future. So what we're trying to describe should be possible on the one hand, and it should be plausible on the other. But the main purpose of scenarios, where they come from, is exactly to initiate what we have now, a discussion on what might happen. And the reason for that is that we're all embedded, invested, entrenched in certain environments. And more often than not, we think that the future will be basically a continuation of the past. And particularly in migration, migration policy over the last at least 10 years, the opposite was the case. It was hardly the case that the future was a continuation of the past, but there were major and disruptive and unexpected events that clearly changed the nature of migration, but also the nature of migration policy making and governance. So the first step is to step out of the current environment, take a look at it and think, do we really know what might happen? Are there things that we should consider when we think about the future? And most importantly, of course, then the consequence of that, are we prepared for events that might happen and that we have not factored in our planning yet? Next slide, please. And here comes the next problem. Some of you might have seen the next 2 slides before. When we speak about the next year, we speak rather about the weather and not about the climate. And on migration, the developments on migration, we know pretty well about the climate, how long-term drivers, megatrends, factors, however you want to call it, influence a longer development, but it's pretty difficult to say what will happen next year. I don't want to start a discussion now on climate change, but there are certain similarities for those who are open to the facts that are communicated on climate change. It might be obvious that the summers are getting warmer and warmer or hotter and hotter. But still, when you want to plan for the next August, for the first 2 weeks, you cannot be sure whether it will rain or not during those 2 weeks, even when you know about the long-term trends. And the same problem that we have when we want to look at what might happen in the close future, that's much more difficult than to say what will happen in the more distant future. So a bit theoretically put, a current migration situation and migration in a year is always a short-term manifestation of long-term trends and drivers that we know, and so-called black swan events. Black swan events are characterized by that they are impactful, so that they're significant, that they change the environment, and that they are largely unexpected. So there will always be someone who will have predicted what will happen before, but the question is always, was it part of a broader debate? And coming back to your inputs in the chat before, when it's about the black swan events, there is again, we can break it down to 2 categories. There are the so-called known unknowns. What will happen in Ukraine? What will happen in other regions? How will, as you have said, the policy of the US or President Trump influence certain drivers, so certain developments. So those are the known unknowns. We can speculate about those. And then there are the unknown unknowns. And here a classical example would be COVID-19, highly impactful on mobility and migration, but not expected by too many before it actually happened. Does it make sense to speculate about the unknown unknowns? That's the question. I think it's more constructive to discuss about the known unknowns and how they might evolve and change our realities in the next year. Next slide, please. I will not go through this slide in detail, but as I've said before, we know pretty well what drives longer term developments. And there are various factors ranging from conflict, demography, economic aspects, development aspects, communication aspects, also climate change, down to the decision making at the individual or group levels. When we look at what drives the policy or political debate, not only in Europe but globally, then it's rather those types of migration or those migration dynamics that are linked to the first important set of drivers, war, civil war, and displacement. So that is always, there's a strong correlation between this driver and the numbers of irregular arrivals and asylum seekers or refugees displaced, generally speaking. So we, of course, always ask ourselves, how did that driver develop? How will it develop, and what impact is there? As you've also said in the chat before, in the question before, demography, economy, every year the impact of those drivers is felt more and has meanwhile also reached the political debate, policy making, and the development of concrete programs much more than it used to, let's say, 10 years ago. This year, I think of particular relevance is an aspect that is covered here under the so-called opportunity structures. That is the impact of migration regimes, of migration policies on actual developments and trends. This is something we also ask ourselves with a particular emphasis this year. The buzzword here is packed, which will come up a bit later, and I think occupies the working time, and maybe more than the working time of many of you at the moment. Next slide, please. So the next two slides, I just present some of the main figures that we look at throughout the year, together with my colleagues from the research unit, from the policy unit, the colleagues from the regions that we are working in. It is always about quantitative statistical indicators that somehow form a first picture or indicate where important developments might be. And I quote just a few of those here. For the first time in years, there is an expected decrease in the number of globally displaced. UNHCR estimates that this number will be going down for basically the reason of a return of many of those displaced in major situations. I will come to that a bit later. The UN debate, of course, the key indicators that occupy, you can say, at least the public or political debate, always asylum applications and apprehensions of or detections of irregular arrivals at the external borders. Both of those decreased again significantly last year, and even more significantly over the duration of 2 years. That informs an outlook on the next year. Still, there was quite some pendulum movements in the area of temporary protection. The overall number is more or less stable, but there's a lot of back and forth movements, obviously, and also a certain change in the demographic composition of this group, leaning towards younger men, which also might have policy implications. When I said there's a decrease in the forcibly displaced, this does not mirror the global conflict situation or peace situation, no matter how you want to call it. This has worsened during the last year again. And normally, this should translate into more displacement, but it hasn't. Another question is, will it this year or next year? Can we be certain that this will happen or not happen? Taking into account that, again, we have a global population of displaced, but when we break it down, there's a high concentration on certain nationalities and countries of origin, and there's also a high degree of concentration of where displaced actually go when they cross borders, to also a rather small number of main countries or regions of destination. So those will be somehow more affected in one way or the other by how the first population develops, grows, decreases, and also behaves. Next slide, please. Moving over to something we considered for this year's outlook more in detail, and that is the famous or infamous EU-wide return rate, which has turned into a major indicator for discussing the success or non-success of EU migration policy. It has increased by 48% last year. When looking at the latest indicators, that sounds pretty good. In absolute terms, it means it has increased from a bit more than 18% to 27%. And then I think this reflects a bit more the reality that although there is an increase in returns, so you can also say in the success rate on returns, there's still a large number every year of those who are obliged to leave the territory of the European Union where these returns are not affected. An indicator we wanted to look at this year is the cut to global humanitarian aid and refugee assistance, and whether this might have consequences. There are significant cuts expected, and I will come to this later also. This should definitely be reflected on the debate about what might happen next year. As was also mentioned in the short survey in the beginning, the issue of labor migration becomes more and more central also of a broader political debate and of migration governance measures. What can we expect for the next year? There is a moderate increase expected for the Eurozone, so moderate economic recovery. This against the background of a continuous and in reality rather dramatic decrease in the number of working age population, which in one way results, and here the broad estimates speak about 0.2% annually of a loss in GDP across the EU. This may not sound that much, but accumulated over the years, this is also quite dramatic. So the economic consequences of demographic aging, and moving to the meso or micro level, it is felt already. That was for me one of the most interesting figures of last year. There was a huge survey, Eurobarometer survey, among small and medium enterprises in Europe, the backbone of our economy, and the backbone also, I think, about our welfare state approach in the EU, and so on and so forth. And the SMEs said that skills shortages are today the biggest challenge that they're facing. This is a bigger challenge than energy costs. That's a bigger challenge than the tariffs that were introduced. That's a bigger challenge than competition or any other factor. And I think that's also quite remarkable, and will also influence the debate and the policy making in the next year more prominently than in the past. Next slide, please. So on the basis of what I've shortly described before, we arrived at our 10 issues, migration issues to look out for in 2026. I will summarize them now briefly. Again, coming back to the issue of conflict, there is a record conflict level, globally speaking. There's a decline in overall peacefulness. It's one of the indicators used by one of the main authorities looking at that, the Global Peace Index. However, a normal development or expected development would have been that also the number of the individuals worldwide forcibly displaced increases then, but the opposite is the case. There is an expected decrease taking place this year, but the main reason for that are returns, voluntary returns, but also enforced returns, mainly to Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, and Ukraine. So this also makes obvious that the increase in conflict and the observed decrease in forced displacement is not necessarily a stable trend. It's a volatile situation that might pretty quickly move in the other direction. And I think everybody should be aware of this fact. Next slide, please. So the global crisis, and it was the second conclusion that we have drawn, are and remain the great unknown also when it comes to developments in Europe or in the EU. The second time, the numbers of detected irregular crossings and the asylum figures, where we lag a bit behind in end of the year figures, went down, and they went down significantly. This translates to the lowest level since the end of mobility restrictions related to the COVID-19 crisis. Again, we speak about the 2 years trend, and that leads also to the conclusion that if nothing big happens, and I am here in line also with the conclusions of the first European report on migration and asylum linked to the pact, we should expect similar developments next year or even further declining trends. However, the trends, and I say it again, based on previous experience, somehow represent a decoupling from the trend of that conflict results in more displacement, which then also affects the numbers in Europe. So caution needs to be recommended there. Again, the conclusion is if nothing big, if nothing unexpected happens, then we should see similar trends or even further decreasing trends in 2026. Next slide, please. Here, this falls also a bit under the policy of scales and numbers. For those who have seen previous editions of this presentation, there were still the years 2015 and 2016 in the graphs, with, of course, enormous numbers linked to the so-called refugee crisis, both in terms of asylum applications and in terms of arrivals. So then all the other columns looked rather small compared to that. Now, the first year, we do not have those big years. But here, again, the developments represent a, meanwhile, 2 years decrease and stable developments with regard to a reduction of the numbers, both when it comes to irregular crossings and asylum applications. Next slide, please. It's even more pronounced when we look at the migratory routes, where you can really see the difference to the years, particularly 2022 and 2023. I think this depicts this mentioned decrease in a rather appealing way. And also here, it's always important not just to look at the last year, but also at least 2 or 3 years back. I saw this mentioned frequently this year that the decrease at the central Mediterranean route has stopped, or that there's almost a trend reversal there. But when you compare it to the situation 2 years ago, then there's still a very clear downward trend there. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the global crisis are the great unknown for 2026. Again, looking at 2025, what were the main factors influencing the downward trends? The most important single individual factor was the situation in Syria or related to Syria. Almost 71% fewer asylum applications in 2025, and this has had, of course, a big impact both on the figures related to arrivals, but also to asylum applications as a whole. But we also think that we can see clear effects of policy interventions of the last and of previous years. There are the number of cooperation agreements between the EU and neighboring countries with strong control elements. There are the control and expulsion policies in the wider neighborhood, often referring to Afghan, displaced in Iran, Pakistan, also in Turkey, or sub-Saharan African migrants or irregular migrants in North African countries. Those measures were clearly reinforced over the last 2 years and also had their impacts then on the arrivals in the EU. But I also think that there are effects of the, you can say, intra-EU or more European Union-related policy interventions, the internal border controls that were affected, the stricter enforcement of migration regimes, return policies, restrictions on family reunifications, cuts in support, the pilots or the discussion on externalization of asylum processing and return hubs will also have had signaling effects and certain impact on the reduction of numbers. So we have two opposing trends. We have those policies that are basically focusing on control or reduction of certain migration flows. At the same time, the trend towards more violence and towards more conflict. And I think it's still open or too early to say how these two trends will relate to each other in 2026. Next slide, please. Yeah, also an open question that is hard to answer is what are the impacts of cuts to humanitarian and aid and refugee aid? First of all, it's not easy to establish a figure. I think nobody really knows how deep the cuts really will be. The most often quoted is, globally speaking, 40% cuts expected in 2026 to humanitarian aid and refugee assistance. And this will inevitably lead to shortfalls in the support in or for key origin and host countries. And those in a neighborhood from a European perspective warrant particular attention. Here, there is a high risk that this funding or lack of funding exacerbates already precarious living conditions for vulnerable populations. And this might also trigger primary or secondary movements towards the EU, as was the case in the past. Next slide, please. Also, something that is not a trend related only to last year, but has been observed already previously, is that the North African countries in the neighborhood will more and more turn also into destinations for different kinds of migration flows. Those countries will most likely be affected even more in 2026 from conflict-driven migration out of sub-Saharan Africa. On the one hand, this forms the basis for even closer cooperation on migration issues. So there's more and more the shared objective of preventing these flows from happening or reducing them. I also think that the cooperation will go beyond that. So labor migration, skills cooperation, skills development aspects will also form part of that deeper cooperation. Still, both sides in the long run will have to better tackle the root causes of displacement. Irregular migration prevention alone will not solve the situation in the long run. Next slide, please. That's the big one on the pact. So 12th of June 2026, the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum will fully apply. A dream for some, a nightmare for many, presumably also in this virtual room. A lot of work still needs to be done. Still, and that is a conclusion, remarkable progress. Principally, many observers, including myself, were not sure that the pact would ever be politically agreed, and were also not sure that such a tremendous progress in such a short amount of time was realistic. In 2026, I expect that this political, institutional, legislative project will for the first time be measured against tangible results. So yes, the pact is much broader, but the central political promise was and still is that the return numbers go up, irregular arrivals go down, and asylum applications go down as well. There is tailwind from the trends of the past years, so this will help. And I think the return rate will be one of the key indicators that will be discussed publicly and politically, and will be used as an indicator for the success of the pact. I also expect that the return rate will go up, at least moderately, as a result of the accumulated effects of policy changes in 2026. Next slide, please. We always try to be balanced in our outlook, so not only look at those issues that are like in the center of public media political attention. So there's always the second pillar, and that is looking at what has happened and what might happen in the areas of labor migration. Here, as discussed before, and as also was brought up in the chat, there will be a considerable demand for foreign workforce due to structural effects of demographic aging and change, and the economic recovery. A trend will continue that was observed previously, which I would call a recalibration of national labor migration policies. So they become more targeted. This also means that there will be a reduction in regarding certain groups, but more openings towards others. So you can also say the national labor migration policies become more professional also next year. There will be a reinforced efforts to overcome, address the skills mismatch, the mismatch between formal qualifications needed on European labor markets and those that are available. There's a number of initiatives that really for the first time would say seriously will address that. Of course, they're still small, but scaling up can happen fast once the experiences are made and the lessons are learned, against the background of a structurally growing demand for that. Geopolitical dynamics is also interesting. The Migration Outlook mentions the Global Gateway Initiative and the Legal Gateway Office to be opened in India. So here I see a certain trend that the migration changes its role when it comes to its geopolitical dimension. 2015, for the first time in view of the refugee crisis, European governments or the EU seriously tried to use a geopolitical position to achieve migration-related goals. And now more and more cooperation on labor mobility becomes part of the geopolitical toolbox that should improve the standing of the EU in terms of a stiffening geopolitical competition, to put it mildly. And this will also this trend I think will also continue next year. Question is, are we really ready to offer openings on labor migration as part of our geopolitical positioning. And we move to the last slide. The latecomer this year, there's always an issue that comes in late. So without this number 10, we would have ended up with 9 issues. This case, it was the US strike in Venezuela at the beginning of January. Then, of course, also journalists ask us, what effects do you expect? We had to say, well, we really don't know. First of all, yes, Latin American nationals form a key group of asylum seekers in Europe, traditionally over the last couple of years. The seismic shift in US policy, and we can really speak about that, had clear impacts on migration dynamics in the Americas and also knock-on effects in upstream countries, if you want to call it like that, in Latin America, certain changes towards more the southern Latin American countries. In case of EU, the conclusion is not that clear. So an clear increase in asylum applications from Venezuelans, almost exclusively in Spain, but a reduction in applications from other important Latin American countries of origin, Peru and Colombia. So an inconclusive conclusion for what happened last year. What might happen in 2026, not very sensational. There's 2 major scenarios. The first one is one similar or comparable to the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, that the diaspora returns, that people wait, that asylum claims in the EU decrease. Scenario number 2 is that the instability deepens in Venezuela, but then also in the region. And this would then also have certain spillover effects in Europe. So again, a rather moderate growth can be expected. Why? Because of the available means of transport. It's not so easy to get to Europe. In any case, depending on how Europe politically positions itself in terms of the assessment of the development in Venezuela, it might have, again, also an impact on the broader political debate. If Europe considers Venezuela now safe, then this might find the approval of the US government, and then Europe says it's not safe. This might also have a political fallout. So it can be expected, depending on the degree of attention that the US administration wants to devote to the issue, that the issue of Latin American asylum seekers in Europe becomes more of a topic also in the European political debate than before. Herewith I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention and give the floor back to Madeleine.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this insightful presentation. In your final slides, you also touched, of course, on the pact. And as you said, Martin, I agree this might be one of the particularly relevant developments for many in our audience this year. Not only in view of the deadline in June 2026, which we're all very aware of, but much beyond. And this is something we already see very clearly in our day-to-day work of the Member States program, as we're currently supporting 5 EU member states, so that's Czechia, Estonia, Ireland, Lithuania, and Romania, in different aspects of the pact preparation. And these efforts are supported through the Commission's technical support instrument with a particular focus on operationalization. What we can see from this work is that many topics are very common and questions are very much the same across member states. And we see that member states can really learn from one another and also build on existing national experience. So I believe this resonates with quite a few colleagues in our audience today, for whom the pact will remain on the agenda over the coming months. But let's see what you all have to say about that. We will now open the floor for questions. You should now see Slido opening up on the right side of your screen again, and the poll is open as of now, so you can ask your questions directly there, or as we said before, please feel free to also use the chat for this purpose.
Thanks, Martin, also for from my side for this insightful presentation. We have already a few questions coming in. One was actually already raised during your presentation when you're referring to issue number 2, the global crisis, the great unknown, when you presented the data. And it was referring to, you mentioned the decline in the past 2 years of asylum applications, but before there was from 2021, 2022, 2023 an increase. And the question was referring to, is the spike in asylum primarily due to the Ukraine crisis? I hope Jumper that raised the question from Ireland, that's the correct interpretation of your question. Please.
Yes, no, definitely not, because the majority of displaced and refugees from Ukraine, particularly in the first 2 years, really, I wouldn't say exclusively, but almost exclusively tried to get granting of a protection status under the temporary protection regime. And so the number of asylum seekers from Ukraine increased every year, last couple of years. So there is also the question, why is that the case? We cannot really know. One possible explanation was that it is actually young men who see a better chance when they apply for asylum or get convention protection or subsidiary protection, that they can avoid being drafted. Now we have seen a change here in policy in Ukraine that men in this age group can leave the country, so the exit ban has been lifted. But still, the asylum figures are comparatively high. Again, the question is, do people expect that their status, that protection status other than temporary protection, provides them with better offers for integration, with a better prospects of long-term stay? We do not really know. But still, when we look at the total figures also of new grantings of temporary protection, then the asylum seekers, or at least EU-wide, are only a small fraction among, also you can say, new applicants for protection in the EU.
Thanks, Martin. Another question comes from Daniel from SAM. It refers to the slides you were presenting in the beginning with the different kind of statements, data that you've used to highlight certain elements, and he's referring to the 43% of small middle enterprises that see skills shortages as the biggest challenge. So the question is, from where does this source come from? What is the source? What about the shifts in terms of production, trade war, and developments of remote work in the service sectors?
Yeah, first of all, I just found what the source is. You find the source also in the Migration Outlook, of course, that I think the colleagues will share the link. It's footnote 92. It's European Commission Flash Eurobarometer 5059, which basically deals with startups, scale-ups, and entrepreneurship. So again, it's the footnote 92, where you also find then in the source you find the actual other figures that are also very interesting, where the small and medium enterprises see the challenges and also what they would need to flourish better. When it comes to the question, how will labor market demands grow and develop in face of technological innovation, of all the aspects that you have mentioned, there are basically, and since many years, there are two rival schools also inside of ICMPD, and there's one school that strongly emphasizes that technological change will basically result in a significant reduction of the demand for labor force, and that now with AI we have now the next technological jump that will basically ease the pressure when it comes to demographic aging, because not so much workforce will be needed. And the second school is more the empirical one that says, well, we had many technological jumps already in the last decades, and the demand for workforce never decreased because of those, just changed to different occupations. It changed to different skill sets also. So again, what do we go for? I would say that this asking now the entrepreneurs, asking the companies, where do you see the biggest problems, is at least for the near future the way to go. Here I have quoted one of the results. We cannot really know in the long run. What I think is not discussed enough is that demographic aging also has an impact on economic growth, development, progress as such. So older societies grow significantly less in terms of GDP than young economies. So it's also the innovation goes back, risk-taking goes back, credit consumption goes back. So aging societies have additional, I would say, economic challenges, and Japan is an example for that, also Eastern European countries. But this goes, of course, beyond like a migration debate, and I also don't want to enter in the debate how we should look at general population compositions, this and that. Honestly, we cannot know how the situation will look in 5-10 years, particularly now with AI, which is definitely something else. Also compared to previous developments. But for the next year, I think the demand will be there, and it will also translate into policies.
Thanks, Martin. Then we have a question from Laura Madeira. Is there a well-established relationship between rising hostility toward migrants and the growth of right-wing populist politics? And should we expect this trend to intensify in the future?
It's a difficult question. Also colleagues from our research unit have done research into what was called, you can say, asylum seeker destination choice, where they looked into all kinds of factors at the macro level, so quantitative factors from GDP growth, Human Development Index, age composition, unemployment rates, to identify what makes a country interesting as a destination. And difficult to grasp. Also, by the way, it's more like economic considerations to choose a destination. It's not so much welfare benefits or anything like that. The opportunity to live with the family is important. So I think here the restrictions of last year might have had an impact really on that. But the image of a country is also important. So now what forms the image of a country is, again, many different factors and aspects. But I think that a hostile attitude towards immigration definitely has an impact, but I don't think that it is possible to measure that. When you look now at the very pronounced example, to put it diplomatically, of what the US did last year, then obviously, at least in the short run, also this almost uber hostile signaling towards certain types of migration obviously had an impact. But whether this will last or not, we cannot really say and cannot really tell. So yes, I think we can assume that this has an impact, but we can not really quantify it, I think, and we will never be able to quantify it.
Thanks. Then we have another question from Maike Jäger. What are your expectations regarding the developments in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iran? So quite comprehensive one. Please, Martin.
Yeah, very different situations in a way. with Iran, there was also the question internally a lot now, what is to be expected? Again, first thing you do, you look at the figures, and there was even a further decrease from a very low baseline when it comes to asylum applications and irregular arrivals after the military strikes and also after the water emergency situation in summer. So both aspects have obviously not resulted in bigger dynamics yet. We don't know what the future will bring. Iran is a major host country. Iran is, despite of political situation, comparatively stable and economically strong compared to many other countries in the region. So a significant destabilization for whatever reason might have huge impacts. So that is known unknown, but this really might have huge impacts on all kinds of dynamics, also migration related in the region. Gaza situation has never resulted in significant flows to Europe in the EU. People cannot really leave. Neighboring countries are, apart from Egypt, the strong humanitarian focus, are not ready to open their borders. People also, up until now, do not want to move because they think they will never be able to return. The question of Lebanon is a major host country, and this brings me to one of the points that I really wanted to stress, and that is the question with the reduction of humanitarian aid. Is a major host country, and here I have in front of me a rather sober but also somber assessment by UNHCR on the effects or impacts of this reduction of humanitarian aid. UNHCR says basically almost 12 million people, displaced people, will be affected and are at risk of losing direct assistance in 2025, 2026. 430,000 people, displaced people or refugees, are at risk of losing this assistance in Lebanon. So this tells you, given the geographical proximity to Europe, to Turkey, that this is definitely a situation that warrants attention, and is a general. If anyone would ask me, Martin, based on what you have looked at in the Outlook, what would your one recommendation be? The Outlook is not about recommendations, but maybe the discussion here is like European governments, all interested governments should really look at this humanitarian. I'm not talking about development, I'm talking really the direct humanitarian assistance for displaced people in camps or camp-like situations. If this is not resolved, it really might lead to significant movements out of those situations. So this warrants attention. It will cost to avoid this risk from materializing financially, but it might be a very well spent investment.
Thanks, Martin. And I know we're already a little bit past 11, but there's still one more question from Champa Sharma in the Q&A. She's asking, did the border crossings via the central Mediterranean route drop due to arrangements between EU and Libya? Maybe you can just share in a few sentences your answer before we wrap up.
Well, obviously, yes, in the sense that the cooperation is as complex and complicated as it might be between the EU and Libya, always also then led to that embankments or crossings were prevented. Again, I think this summer there was a situation where departures from Libya increased significantly. Again, there were interventions based on this complex and complicated cooperation that had an impact. So yes, definitely. At the same time, like in any other more significant situation of, say, rather established irregular movements, nobody is ever fully in control of those. So and this also refers to that situation.
Thanks, Martin. We're now coming to the end of the session. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us a bit longer. As mentioned earlier, the presentation, but also the webinar recording, as well as a selection of a few news items on the Outlook, but as well as our new DG and interviews will be shared with you after this webinar. Before we fully wrap up, we would really appreciate your feedback on today's event. Our colleague have just posted in the chat a link to a feedback survey, and I promise it takes less than 1 minute to complete. So we would be really grateful if you could take the time to fill it in before you log off. And while we're waiting, we're giving you a few seconds. Maybe Alfred, you can already let us know what the next webinar will focus on.
Yeah, exactly. I think one important thing to mention, ICMPD, of course, produces its annual migration outlook. Martin always there with really excellent work. But of course, in the next days and weeks, we also produce outlooks on the different regions where we are operating and working. So please look also out for those ones. Also referring to the question about different situation in different countries. Some things are of course covered in this general migration outlook, but of course they will also be addressed then in the regional ones. And this is exactly what we will also be doing with our next webinar. So in the next webinar organized by the Member States program, we will take a closer look at specific regional trends and dynamics, focusing on the regions where ICMPD is working, and we will share some practical insights. So really stay tuned for upcoming invitations, for the upcoming, let's say, as Martin called it, then the weather forecast, and we hope you will be joining us, of course, again. Thanks again, Martin, for taking the time to share your insights. Thanks again as well to all our participants for joining us. We wish you a really smooth start into 2026 and hope that today's discussion and insights provide you also with some useful perspectives for the months to come. With that, we wish you a very nice rest of the day. Goodbye, and see you then next time for the next weather forecast.